Okay, hello everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the start of the day with our trainee talks. It's my pleasure to get the next session started, chaired by Carmen Canavier, who's going to start things off with a tutorial about oscillatory mechanisms and neural circuits. So without further ado, take it away, Carmen.
Okay, as Scott said, I'm going to do a brief tutorial on oscillatory mechanisms, and I'm going to start with pacemaker neurons. And what you're seeing here on the upper left is an oscilloscope representation. On the right is a time series representation of a pacemaker single spiking neuron. And I'm using a reduced Hodgkin-Huxley model. And on the bottom left is a phase plane representation. So the reduced Hodgkin-Huxley model only has two variables, one for membrane potential and one for a recovery variable, which combines the activation of the delayed rectifier and the inactivation of the fast sodium current. And these differential equations are nonlinear, and so they produce a limit cycle. And so in this state space of the membrane potential and the recovery variable, we trace out a limit cycle in which time is implicit. And this is a nonlinear oscillator, and if you perturb away from the limit cycle, you return to it. So why can't these poor pacemakers rest? And we have pacemaker neurons in the mammalian midbrain. The dopamine neurons are pacemakers. The neurons in the subthalamic nucleus are pacemakers. Also, the substantia nigra pars reticulata and the globus pallidus have pacemaker neurons. And these neurons, poor neurons, can't rest. They just have to fire continuously in a pacemaker-like fashion. And we can understand this by looking at the phase plane representation. And here on the y-axis, I now have the recovery variable. And on the x-axis, I have membrane potential. And I have plotted the voltage null line, which is cubic, which is a set of points at which the rate of change of membrane potential, the set of points of V and W, at which the rate of membrane potential change is exactly zero. And I've also plotted the null line for the recovery variable. And that's the set of values of V and W for which the rate of change of the recovery variable is zero. And of course, the neuron can only rest at the intersection of these two null lines where the derivative of both variables is zero. And this would be called a fixed point, and it's the resting potential of a neuron. But the interesting aspect is that you do have a cubic. It's typical in these, and for neurons to have a cubic null line for membrane potential. And that means you have a stable branch on the left, a stable branch on the right, but you have an unstable central branch. And it's unstable because there's positive feedback. This is called it's due to a negative slope conductance, meaning that in this case, it's a sodium channel. And if you depolarize, you open sodium channels, which causes more depolarization. If you hyperpolarize, you close sodium channels, which causes more hyperpolarization. So this middle branch is repellent. It's unstable. And so what happens with a quiescent neuron, if you perturb it a little bit, and this is how people normally think of neurons as quiet and waiting for an input, and you get an input and wasn't quite enough to make it fire, or if you get a larger input, it causes an action potential. And that's because this larger input crosses the boundary of this middle branch of the null line, which is unstable, and forces it to loop out and around and back to the fixed point for an action potential. But what happens if your fixed point actually lands, if the intersection lands in that unstable middle branch? Then any little perturbation knocks you off that fixed point and out into this limit cycle. And hence the origin of the repetitive limit cycle and why you have single neuron pacemakers. All right, so now that we've thought about a single neuron as an oscillator, I want to think about how coupling single neurons could cause coordinated network activity. And what I'm showing here is the clocks from Christian Huygens clocks on a metal beam that coordinated their activity via push-pull mechanical interactions along a wooden beam. But I'm interested in how neurons, oscillatory neurons, interact with each other and coordinate their activity. So as I said before, this is now the Morris-Lee-Carr, but similar phase plane. You have the recovery variable, you have membrane potential, and this is the time series, and you can go fast or you can go slow, but basically the representation in the phase plane is quite similar. And the peak of an action potential has a phase of 0, and the peak of the next action potential has a phase of 1. Since it's circular, they're the same point. As you move along the limit cycle, your phase increases. Like I said, time is only implicit. But here's the peak of the action potential. And now if you're traveling along the limit cycle and you receive a perturbation from another neuron and it knocks you backwards in the opposite direction of motion, then you're going to get a delay. And now it's going to take longer for you to come around to the phase at which you trigger a spike. On the other hand, if you get a perturbation that bumps you in the direction of the motion of limit cycle, that's going to increase your phase. That's going to decrease the time until the next spike, and that's called an advance. And so we're going to tabulate this information on how neurons interact with each other. And I want to point out that you may have heard of infinitesimal phase resetting curves and weak coupling theory. I'm not going to use weak coupling theory. I'm going to use more like pulsatile coupling theory and the spike time resetting curve. So this is a regularly firing neural pacemaker, a single spiking oscillator, and I'm going to give it a perturbation in terms of synaptic conductance. So this is what happens if one neuron or a group of neurons in the same network were to fire. How is that going to perturb the activity of the first neuron? And I guess I said we're defining the phase at the peak as 0, phase at the next peak is 1, and then we're prorating the phase is then increasing throughout the cycle. Here I'm hitting it at about a phase of 0.5. If this were a linear time invariant system, then it wouldn't matter when you gave the perturbation. But this is not a time invariant system. It's a nonlinear system, and it very much matters where on the limit cycle you perturb it. And so a phase resetting curve or phase response curve tabulates the normalized change in the cycle period. So this is the change in the cycle period divided by the cycle period. And we're going to call that f of phi. I'm going to call that just an arbitrary function of the phase resetting, and delays are going to be negative and advances positive. So how can I use this phase resetting curve? Well, I'm going to take the simplest example, and that is of one oscillator forcing another. And so this is a forcing oscillator. It has a period of P1, and when it's not connected to another neuron, then these two neurons don't have the same period, and so they get phase walkthrough. There's no particular relationship between when this neuron fires in the cycle of the other neuron. But if you allow the driver neuron to perturb the driven neuron, you can then get a phase locking where there's a consistent, this is the firing of the driver, this is the firing of the driven, firing of the driver, firing of the driven, and there's a consistent phase locking relationship now. And the only way that can happen is if the perturbation that the driven neuron receives from the driver makes its period exactly the same as the forcing neuron. And so that can easily be accomplished by giving a phase resetting at the correct phase. That's going to change the period from P2 to P2 times 1 minus the phase resetting. And how can I determine what the phase lock points would be? Well, say if I need it, say if there's a 10% difference in the period, there's only 2 points at which I can hit it, a phase of 0.3 and a phase of 0.8, and that would give the correct change in the period. But how do I know which one would be stable? And the quick answer is it's the slope of the phase resetting curve. I've reproduced here the stable phase locking with the driver firing at a consistent phase of the driven neuron, always at a phase of phi. But then consider the case where you get a little noise, and when the driver fires, the driven neuron doesn't actually have exactly a phase of phi. Now it's phi minus delta. Well, if you do a little algebra, and you take phi and you move it along and you linearize so that you pretend like the change is just proportional to the slope of the phase resetting curve times that perturbation delta, then what's going to happen is your forced neuron is not going to fire exactly when it would have before, when there was no noise. And the difference in the time that it's going to fire is going to be the perturbation delta plus the slope of the phase resetting curve times that perturbation delta. That's going to be the jiggle. That's going to be the jitter. So if the slope is exactly -1, then delta plus negative delta is 0, and the perturbation goes away in one cycle. But the important point is that if the slope is negative, that perturbation gets smaller and smaller. So this is just a case of a driven oscillator, but you can do a similar analysis for many network patterns. And I'll give one example here in the context of interneuronal network gamma. So we have gamma being 40 hertz oscillations, and one mechanism that's been proposed often for gamma is that simply coordination between oscillatory interneurons. And this is a schematic representation, although I have 300 sparsely connected inhibitory interneurons, and they're actually Hodgkin-Huxley type neurons, and they can synchronize their activity. Here's a raster plot. Here's the activity of a single neuron. but what I'm doing, I'm doing a phase resetting analysis, but roughly speaking, it's what is the perturbation that a single neuron would receive when all the other neurons in the network fire. And that's the phase resetting curve here. It's a very strong phase resetting curve, because if you get an input right before you're going to fire at a phase just before 0.1, then it's going to delay you by almost an entire cycle. Whereas if you get a perturbation right after you fire, it doesn't delay you hardly at all. So between just below 1 and 1, you have an extremely strong positive slope, which is very, very destabilizing. So with no delay, this system can't synchronize. But if you put a little bit of delay in it, so that when each neuron fires, it doesn't shut down the other neurons, but instead it gets an input a little bit afterwards, and it doesn't change the period that much, putting in that delay moves the operating point on the phase resetting curve to a region where the slope is negative and not positive, and so it allows this synchronization. So that's one example. Now, another example of some coupled oscillator mechanisms that have been proposed for gamma, for example, would be the classical ping mechanism. And in the classic ping mechanism, the excitatory neurons, shown here in black, are always above threshold. They're driven above threshold. So they fire a population volley. The I neurons, the inner neurons, are below threshold. So therefore, they only jump and they only fire when the excitatory population tells them to. But once the inner neurons fire, that causes enough inhibition across the network, this is a summed inhibition in the network, that you get a pause. And then when that inhibition decays, the excitatory neurons are above threshold, and they're going to fire and cause the inner neurons to fire, and that's going to give a wave of inhibition again. So it's just, this is a commonly proposed mechanism for gamma. In this case, it's an oscillatory mechanism because the E cells are above threshold, but it's waves of inhibition that quiet the network for a while. Now, this next slide, I'm only going to speak about briefly, and I wanted to speak about it to introduce some of the work that's going to be in the session later. And so I'm talking about, this is now cross-frequency coupling, and you can have a gamma oscillation on the left-hand side, a classic ping, as I described, where these are the I cells now in red and the E cells in green. But if you block all the E to I cell connections, then you get no I cell firing. So this is classic ping. And what I'm showing is it being driven by theta. So Alexandra is going to talk about theta later. And so theta is maybe a slower oscillation, maybe 8 hertz. And it has this can have nested 40 hertz in it, because this oscillation can drive you through the quiescent phase to the repetitive firing phase and back into a quiescent phase, and specifically driving the E cells in that case. Now, there's another mechanism for synchronization that I just wanted to bring up briefly, because I think Paola Malerba might later talk about transient synchronization, although this is in the context of Ing. I think she may be talking more in terms of ripples. But so this was actually a poster we did at SFN this year, that there was a theta drive in an Ing network. So on the left hand's ping, right hand's just Ing, and we've got a 500 neuron network and of just inhibitory neurons, and we're driving them with theta, but we don't really get any nested gamma, because the phase resetting characteristics for this particular network didn't promote it, and there's too much noise as well. But if you give it a strong excitation, if you give it some phasic excitation, which could happen this was in the context of the medial entorhinal cortex, it could happen with stellate neurons firing on the upstroke of theta, then you do get transient synchronization. You can line them up for a while. All right. Now I'm going to change gears completely. I've said all I'm going to say about coupled oscillators, repetitive, and I'm going to switch to a network oscillation. This is a completely different mechanism that has been proposed for interneuronal gamma and interneuronal network gamma and pyramidal interneuronal network gamma, Ing and ping, as we will see. So this is the original work of Brunel and Hakim, and they had a sparsely connected network of 5,000 inhibitory leaky integrate and fire neurons. And these leaky integrate and fire neurons, unperturbed, they arbitrarily set a threshold that after you reach threshold, you reset to 10 millivolts. This is a very arbitrary voltage scale, but it's what they use in the original paper, and I'm preserving it. So once you cross 20 millivolts, it's a leaky integrate and fire. So these spikes are just cut and pasted on. You just reset. And with no inhibition, but noise, these neurons fire at a pretty good clip. But now if you turn on inhibition between neurons and you still give it a little bit of noise, now there's so much inhibition in the system, and this is the inhibition building up once you turn on the inhibition, and now it's going to stabilize because the population rate stabilizes, and so the total inhibition received by any given neuron is going to stabilize, and it's going to be below threshold at about 18 millivolts would be on average what the inhibition it receives makes it. So there would be no firing at all except for noise. And since there is noise, you get it's drift diffusion. So the bias current is giving you drift, the noise gives you diffusion, and you basically have a random walk, and occasionally that Brownian motion random walk causes you to fire. So that means this is the fluctuation-driven regime. This is the mean-driven regime. Here, the firing rate is just determined by the drive to the oscillator. Here, it's purely noise-driven. And with more noise, the Brownian motion gets bigger amplitude and more noticeable, that you've got a big spread about the average. So when you increase the noise, you actually increase the firing rates. So that means you get more inhibition, and you're on average farther from threshold. And in context, what does this mean? It means you can get a stochastic population oscillator, because in this case where you had the low noise, you have the neurons are firing very sparsely, but a fast population oscillation develops at about 140 hertz. But each neuron's firing very, very, very sparsely, and that's what makes this work. Is if they're firing very sparsely, then their firing looks like the output of a Poisson process with an exponential distribution and plus a refractory period. But if you have too much noise, you just destroy this oscillation. But the point here, this is an alternate mechanism. It is an emergent network phenomenon, and that you get these waves of inhibition, and then you get windows when you've recovered from the inhibition where neurons can escape and fire, but only during those windows. So this is the stochastic population oscillator. It can also apply to the ping, to the pyramidal interneuron gamma. Again, sparse. The firing of individual neurons is sparse and irregular, but you get this emergent waves of inhibition in the network that cause an emergent oscillation. And Andre Longton, I believe, is going to be talking about stochastic ping. All right. So in the little time remaining, I know I'm going to talk about different kind of pacemaker. I'm going to talk about bursting neuron pacemakers. So bursting neurons often pace central pattern generators, for example, in respiration and locomotion. And often so in addition to the two processes that you need for spiking, the fast autocatalytic process, like a sodium channel, and the recovery process, like a potassium channel or inactivation of sodium, you need a third process that's going to sweep you slowly through the repetitive firing and the quiescent phases. And in this example model, when we block spikes, you can see the underlying envelope of a square wave burster. The square wave burster is the most common, so it's the only one I'm going to discuss. Basically, we had to add a third equation, a slow variable. In this case, it's calcium. Calcium comes in via voltage-gated calcium channel and activates a calcium-activated potassium channel, which terminates the burst. So basically, this oscillation in calcium concentration is going to sweep you through the repetitive firing phase on the upper branch of the null line and through the quiescent phase on the lower branch. Basically, you're bistable in terms of calcium concentration, and you're driving through a hysteretic loop here, a square wave burster. Now, this is a modeling, early modeling from the respiratory system. I believe that John Rubin is going to expand upon this modeling. It's a model of a burster, and they synchronize via excitatory connections. So synchronized bursting via excitation in a model of the Prebotzinger complex. But there's something else that can happen. They don't have to be synchronized. You can get a half-center oscillation between reciprocally inhibitory neurons. This is an example from the heart of the leech, but you get many examples in the spinal cord and in locomotion elsewhere where you have alternation between a bursting neuron. Now, this could be intrinsic oscillators, but it doesn't have to be. There's coordinated, there's mechanisms of escape and release if you have tonically firing neurons, and I'll just briefly touch on those, and it's the last topic that I have. But so Wang and Rinzel in 1992 wrote about these two mechanisms. If you have neurons that, and then we'll go with the very simplest neuron possible. We're not going to model spiking. We're just going to model a leak conductance and a post-inhibitory rebound current. And I know that I believe Alexandra is going to be talking about post-inhibitory rebound. And let's see. So post-inhibitory rebound current means that specifically we're going to talk about the H current. So the H is a hyperpolarization activated inward current. Now this nullcline is for the H current, and as you can see, you get more activation as you hyperpolarize. So we're going to have one neuron is firing, and it inhibits the partner. So you have a free voltage nullcline, and you have an inhibited voltage nullcline. So, for example, the red neuron here is firing, but it's depolarized, and so the sag current is turning off. Therefore, it's hyperpolarizing. It's going to drop below the threshold for spiking, which means no more. It won't get any more synaptic activation of the partner. You could also accomplish this via depression, but basically, the oscillator that is spiking releases its partner, and here it releases it, and then you need post-inhibitory rebound because once it's released, the partner jumps up. And so they trace out this limit cycle between the two nullclines, free and inhibited. And normally the neuron would just sit here at -50, but it can't get there because of this escape and release mechanism release mechanism, where the partner releases it and it jumps up, and then it releases its partner and then becomes inhibited itself. And the other mechanism requires not only post-inhibitory rebound, but also negative slope conductance region. This is the T channel. Now the H is going to be the inactivation of a T channel. So this T channel current is activated by depolarization, which causes a negative slope conductance region in the inhibited nullcline. So we have a free and inhibited nullcline. But what's different here is the inhibited neuron it removes enough inactivation of this T channel so that it can jump up and escape. So it escapes, and then it inhibits its partner and knocks it down. So we have two mechanisms by which neurons that are just tonically firing can form a half-center oscillator, which, as I said, is common in central pattern generators. So I want to summarize and just say that I've talked about intrinsic oscillators and coupled versus purely network mechanisms, talked about interaction of coupled oscillators, talked about the mean-driven deterministic regime versus fluctuation-driven, and talked about single neuron versus bursting pacemakers. I want to acknowledge Chris Knowlton and Guillaume Villa in my lab, and former lab members Ruben Takiji Hambrian and Chris Moraz, who did most of the work I presented today. Thank you, Scott.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carmen. So we will move straight into the next research talk, which is ready to go. So you guys should get pulled into that talk momentarily. Thank you, Carmen.